The train was late, as trains often were in November. Gideon Hale stood on the platform at Clearwater Station with his collar turned up against a wind that had been cutting down from the north since morning. He wasn't there to meet anyone. He'd come into town for feed and a new hinge for the barn door, and the freight wagon couldn't cross the tracks until the eastbound cleared. So he waited, the way a man learns to wait when he's been living alone for 4 months, quietly, without expectation, watching the minutes pass like they owed him nothing. The town of Clearwater, Wyoming wasn't much to look at in any season, but in late autumn it had a particular bleakness to it. The storefronts along the main drag had their shutters half drawn against the cold. The boardwalks were empty except for a few townspeople moving fast, heads down, intent on getting wherever they were going before the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. The mountains to the west were already white down to the tree line. Gideon had bought the Double H Ranch 6 years ago with his wife, Nora. They'd planned to build something out there, some cattle, horses, maybe a small apple orchard on the south slope if the soil cooperated. In the first 3 years, they'd made real progress. The herd was growing. The house had 2 rooms added onto it. Nora had planted a kitchen garden that produced more than they could eat. Then the fever came through in spring, and by June, Gideon was alone. He didn't talk about it. There wasn't much to say that the empty chair at his table didn't already say louder. He'd kept the ranch running because stopping wasn't something he knew how to do, but the work had become mechanical. You feed the animals. You mend the fence. You eat something cold because you forgot to start a fire. You go to sleep and you don't sleep, and then morning comes and you do it again. He was thinking about the fence hinge, whether he had enough wire already on the property or whether he needed to buy more. When he heard the children. Not heard them exactly, more like became aware of them the way you become aware of weather before it arrives. A low collective tension. He looked down the platform toward the far end of the train, and that's when he saw the group, 7 of them. All different ages, from what looked like a girl of maybe 12 or 13, down to a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5. They were huddled together near a baggage cart, and even at 30 yards, Gideon could see they were cold. Wrong coats for the season. Wrong shoes. The kind of thin, institutional clothing that said nobody had dressed these children for Wyoming in November. Somebody had dressed them to ship them somewhere, and warmth wasn't the concern. What made him look twice were the cards. Each child had a small card pinned to their coat, the way you'd tag freight. He was too far to read them yet, but the cards were there, white against the dark wool, pinned at the chest like labels on inventory. He'd heard of the practice. Orphan trains, placement programs, children sent west from the eastern cities to be distributed to farms and ranches as labor or charity cases, or some combination of both. He'd never actually seen it up close. He told himself it wasn't his business and looked back at the tracks. The eastbound still hadn't come. He looked back at the children. The older girl, the one standing slightly in front of the others, was watching a large man in a good wool coat approach the group. The man had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He was broad across the shoulders, well-fed, wearing a hat that cost more than most men in Clearwater made in a month. He was accompanied by a younger man who appeared to be an assistant of some kind, carrying a leather satchel and a clipboard. The man stopped in front of the older girl and said something. Gideon was too far away to catch the words over the wind. The girl responded. Whatever she said, the man didn't like it. He said something else, louder this time, and pointed at the smaller children. The girl shook her head and moved slightly, positioning herself. Then the man hit her. It wasn't a hard blow, not like he was trying to hurt her, but it was casual, the way you'd cuff an animal that was misbehaving, without anger, without any real weight behind it. Just correction. Just a reminder of position. The sound of it carried on the cold air. The people on the platform who were close enough to see it kept moving. A woman near Gideon turned the other direction. A man by the station door found something interesting to look at on the ground. The girl didn't fall. She didn't cry. She put her hand to her cheek for just a second, and then she straightened and stepped back in front of the others. And her face said, clearly, plainly, to anyone paying attention, that this was not the first time and it would not change anything. Gideon was already moving. He didn't make a decision exactly. His legs made it for him. He crossed the platform in about 15 strides, and by the time he was aware of the full situation, the man, the assistant, the clipboard, the 7 children with their pinned cards, he was already between the man and the girl. "Excuse me," he said. The man turned, unhurried. Up close, he was even larger than he'd looked from a distance, maybe 50, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and now wore its years like a suit of armor. His name, Gideon would learn later, was Harlan Pruitt, Regional Director of the Western Placement Society, a charitable organization in name and a labor procurement operation in practice. "This is society business," Pruitt said. He barely looked at Gideon. "Move along. I saw you strike that child," Gideon said. "I disciplined a ward who was being uncooperative." Pruitt glanced at his assistant. "We have placement arrangements to finalize. These children—" "How much?" Gideon said. That got Pruitt's attention. He turned fully toward Gideon. "I beg your pardon?" Gideon didn't entirely know what he was doing. He was aware of that. He was standing on a train platform on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 months after burying his wife, with a fence hinge in his coat pocket and no plan beyond the next 10 seconds. But the girl was behind him, and the little ones were watching, and something inside him that had been sitting very still for 4 months had come suddenly and unexpectedly awake. "I have a ranch outside of town," he said. "I can take the children. All 7. Pruitt stared at him. Then he laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "This isn't a livestock sale, Mr. Hale. Gideon Hale, Double H Ranch." He met Pruitt's eyes and held them. "I'm asking what the process is." Aunts. It took 2 hours. Pruitt was not happy about it. He made that clear in a dozen small ways. The way he took his time reviewing documents, the way he questioned Gideon's finances, the condition of his property, his marital status. When Gideon said his wife had passed in June, Pruitt's eyes narrowed. A widower, living alone, no woman in the house. "That's right. The society has standards, Mr. Hale." "I expect you do." Gideon kept his voice even. "But I also expect you've been standing on this platform for 2 hours trying to find someone to take these children, and nobody has. So." That landed. Pruitt didn't respond immediately. The children had been watching the exchange from a few feet away. The older girl, Gideon still didn't know her name, had her arms crossed and her expression carefully blank. The look of someone who had learned not to hope for anything so they wouldn't have to handle the disappointment when it didn't come. The smaller ones clustered behind her. A boy of about 8 was holding the hand of a girl who looked younger. At the far edge of the group, a boy of maybe 10 stared at the ground without blinking, somewhere else entirely. Pruitt made Gideon sign 3 forms. He inspected the Double H's deed, which Gideon happened to have in his coat pocket because he'd needed it at the land office that morning. He asked, twice, whether Gideon understood that these children were not livestock and could not be returned if the arrangement proved inconvenient. "I understand," Gideon said both times. When Pruitt finally ran out of obstacles, he gathered the children and addressed them in a flat, businesslike tone, explaining that they would be going to Mr. Hale's ranch and that they were expected to be useful and cooperative and to cause no trouble. The older girl said nothing. She looked at Gideon, a long, measuring look, the kind that sized up a person and filed the information away. And then she looked back at Pruitt. "Our things," she said. "Your possessions are 4 bags, 2 brown, 1 gray, 1 black. They're in the baggage car." Her voice was flat and steady. "We're not leaving without them." Pruitt looked like he was going to argue. Then he nodded at his assistant, who went to retrieve the bags. Gideon looked at the girl. Up close, the card on her coat read, "Troublemaker." He reached over and unpinned it, dropped it on the platform. She watched him do it. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted slightly behind her eyes. "What's your name?" he said. A pause. "Evelyn Cross?" "I'm Gideon." He looked at the others. "Who are the rest?" he asked. He learned their names on the drive back to the ranch, which took 40 minutes in the wagon. Evelyn was 13. She was the oldest and had appointed herself in charge somewhere along the way, by necessity rather than ambition. She'd been in the system for 3 years since her mother died and her father couldn't be located. She didn't volunteer this information. Gideon pieced it together over the following days. But she had the particular competence of a child who'd been forced to become an adult before she was ready. Thomas was 10. Quiet. The one who'd been staring at the ground. He had a card that said defective, which Gideon removed and dropped in the road without comment. Thomas watched this with the same blank expression he wore for everything. He didn't speak on the drive. He wouldn't speak much for weeks. Nettie was 8 and loud in the way children are when they've learned that volume is the only thing that gets them noticed. Her card said, "Wild." She peppered Gideon with questions for the first 15 minutes of the drive and then abruptly fell asleep against the side of the wagon. Carl was 8 also. Not Nettie's twin, he informed Gideon very seriously, just the same age, because he'd had his birthday in April, and Nettie's wasn't until February, and he was the one who'd been holding the younger girl's hand on the platform. He was methodical and watchful and had a way of noticing things without appearing to. The younger girl Carl had been holding was May, who was 6. Her card had said, "Damaged." She hadn't spoken since the platform, and when Gideon quietly asked Evelyn about her, Evelyn said only, "She talks sometimes, not always. Don't push her." He didn't. The remaining 2 were a pair of brothers named Robert and James, 7 and 5 respectively. Robert was the talker of the 2, a stream of observations and questions and commentary. James was the one who'd looked too small for the weather, the youngest of the group, and he'd fallen asleep before the wagon even cleared the edge of town. He slept with his mouth open and one fist curled against his chest, and even in sleep he looked tired. Gideon drove and said very little. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure what he'd done entirely. He had a 3-bedroom house, a main room, his bedroom, and the extra room Nora had planned to use for something that now stood empty, and 2 ranch hands who came Mondays and Thursdays. He had beef cattle, 6 horses, about 40 chickens, and 4 months of accumulated grief that sat in him like stone. He had no plan for children. He hadn't had children, hadn't really thought about the particulars of it. He and Nora had wanted them someday, in the vague and optimistic way of people who assume someday is coming. He glanced over his shoulder at the 7 kids in the wagon bed. Nettie was asleep on one side. Robert was explaining something to Carl using elaborate hand gestures. James was asleep against Evelyn's shoulder. Thomas was watching the landscape go by with those flat, unreachable eyes. May sat with her knees pulled to her chest. Evelyn met his gaze. She did that, caught him looking and held the contact, deliberate, waiting to see what he'd do with it. "House is going to be crowded," he said. "We're used to crowded," she said. "I only have 1 spare room. I'll sleep in the barn until we figure something out. You and May can take my room. Boys can have the spare. It'll be tight, but..." "You don't have to sleep in the barn," Evelyn said. "That's not... You live there." "I know I live there. I'm saying, you don't have to make it easy for us," she said. "Not mean, just clear, the way someone states a fact. We don't expect that. We've been in 12 placements. We know how this goes." He thought about that for a moment. "How does it go?" She looked at him for a second, then looked away. "People take us because they need hands, and then we mess something up, or they decide we're more trouble than we're worth, or they just get tired, and then we go back. And that's what you think is going to happen here." She didn't answer that directly. She wasn't going to make predictions and end up wrong again. He could see that. "All I'm saying," she said carefully, "is you don't have to go sleep in the barn." The house hit him differently that first night with all of them in it. He'd been living in a silence so complete he'd stopped noticing it. His own footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of wind against the windows. That had been the entire vocabulary of the house for 4 months. Walking in now with 7 children ahead of him, the house filled up immediately. Not with noise. They were actually fairly quiet, taking in the space, but with presence, with weight, with the feeling of rooms being used. He showed them around. Main room with the fireplace, the kitchen corner with the wood stove, the table that seated 4 comfortably and 6 with the bench, the bedrooms, the outhouse, the well. Nettie wanted to see the horses. "Tomorrow," he said. "What about the chickens?" "Also tomorrow." "Is there a dog?" He hesitated. There had been a dog. Nora's dog, an old shepherd mutt named Clancy who had died in October. No. Nettie looked at him with 8-year-old severity. "You should get one. I'll take it under consideration." He made dinner, or tried to. He wasn't much of a cook. He'd been eating poorly since June, the kind of food a person makes when they're not really hungry and don't particularly care about the result. He fried salt pork and boiled potatoes and opened a jar of apple preserves and cut a lot of bread, and the children ate like they hadn't seen a real meal in days, which possibly they hadn't. James fell asleep at the table before he finished eating. Gideon caught him before he went sideways off the bench and lifted him, carried him to the spare room where Robert had already claimed a spot near the wall. He laid James down and the boy didn't wake at all, not even when Gideon tucked the blanket around him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the two small sleeping shapes. Carl appeared at his elbow. "He does that," Carl said quietly. "Falls asleep anywhere. Evelyn says it's because he's still catching up from when they didn't sleep enough." "When was that?" "The Haggerty placement, 2 years ago, before I got there." Carl's voice was matter-of-fact in the way children's voices get when they're describing things that should upset someone but have stopped upsetting them. "Evelyn was there for that one." He looked at Carl. "You doing okay?" Carl considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I think so," he said finally. "The food was good." "That's a low bar." Carl almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Pretty low." Evelyn found him after the others were settled, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She sat down on the step below him, which put some distance between them, and looked out at the dark ranch yard. The temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees. She had her arms wrapped around herself. "You'll freeze," he said. "I'm fine." He went inside and came back with one of Nora's old coats from the hook by the door. He held it out. She looked at it for a second, at him, and then took it and put it on without comment. 12 placements, he said after a while. "Yes." "All of you together?" "The last 7. She was quiet. "Before that, we were split up different ways. James was at 3 other places before he came to the group. May's been with us since she was 4. We're the only family she has." "What about you?" Evelyn took a moment. "My mother died. My father, I don't know where he is. He left before she got sick." She said it without inflection, the way you'd state weather. "I was 10 when I went into the system. I was 12 when I found the rest of them. Or they found me, depending on how you look at it. 13 now," he said. 13. "You've been carrying these kids for a year." She looked at him sideways, and for a second she looked exactly her age, 13 and exhausted, and not sure whether to trust the observation or the person making it. Someone had to. He didn't say anything for a while. The stars were clear and hard above the mountains. He could see the barn from the porch, the dark shape of it against the lighter darkness of the sky. "I'm not going to tell you this is permanent," he said finally, "because you'd know I was saying what I thought you needed to hear, and you're too smart for that. What I will tell you is I don't do things halfway. I signed those papers, and I mean what I signed." He paused. "That's all I've got right now." She was quiet for a long time. "Thomas doesn't talk," she said eventually. "He used to, before the Haggerty place. He talks sometimes now, if he's very comfortable, but don't expect it." "Okay. May needs to know where you are. She'll track you. It's not a problem. She just needs to know you haven't left." "Okay. Nettie is loud, but she's not bad. She needs to feel like she's seen. You let her know you see her and she'll settle." "And Carl?" Evelyn looked almost fond. "Carl is Carl. He'll be fine. He's always fine." She hesitated. "Robert talks a lot when he's scared. The more he talks, the more scared he is." "And James?" "James is 5, she said, and her voice shifted, something underneath it that wasn't there when she talked about the others. "He just needs to not be scared." Gideon looked at her. "What do you need?" She blinked, like the question had caught her off guard. Then she looked away. "I need to make sure they're okay." "That's not what I asked." "I know," she said. She stood up, keeping Nora's coat around her shoulders. "I'm going to check on them." She went inside. He heard the door, quiet behind her. He sat with his cold coffee in the 15-degree dark and looked at the mountains and thought about Nora, who had always been better with people than he was, who would have known exactly what to say tonight and probably would have had all 7 kids laughing at the dinner table by the time the food was done. He thought about a girl of 13 who'd been carrying 6 other people for a year and couldn't remember how to answer a question about herself. He sat there for a long time. The cold worked its way in around his collar and through the knees of his trousers. Then he got up and went inside, because the fire was going down and someone needed to put more wood on it. The first full day was harder than the night had been. He had a ranch to run. He was up at 4:30 as always because the animals didn't care what else was happening in the house. By the time the children started appearing in the kitchen around 7, He'd already done the morning feeding, checked the ice on the water troughs, and started a fire in the wood stove. He'd also started breakfast, which went badly. He burned the first batch of oatmeal because he wasn't paying attention, and the second came out watery because he overcorrected. And by the time Nettie appeared in the doorway with her hair doing something impressive and her eyes already sharp, he was staring at a pot of what was technically edible food but wasn't good. "That smells like burning," she said. "It's oatmeal." "It smells burnt." "It's a little burnt. There's molasses in the cabinet if you want it sweeter." Nettie came and stood beside him and looked in the pot. "My mother made oatmeal," she said. He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "I'm not a very good cook," he said. "I am," Nettie said. "A little bit. I helped at the Garfield place." He moved aside without being asked. She took the spoon. She stirred, adjusted the heat, pushing the pan slightly off-center on the stove with the confidence of someone who'd done it before, and added a handful of salt and a splash of water from the bucket and stirred some more. She didn't say anything. She was concentrating. By the time Carl and Robert appeared, what was in the pot looked and smelled meaningfully better. Evelyn appeared last, with May at her side and James still half asleep with his hand in hers. Thomas came a few minutes after that, sat at the end of the table, and accepted a bowl without making eye contact with anyone. Gideon sat at the head of the table and ate burned and then rescued oatmeal with 7 children he'd known for 14 hours. And for a few minutes, nobody said anything because everyone was eating. Then Robert said, "Are there really horses?" "Yes." "How many?" 6. Robert looked at Carl with an expression of deep significance. Carl nodded slowly. "Can we see them today?" Robert asked. "After chores," Gideon said. A short, expectant silence. "What are the chores?" Nettie asked. He looked around the table. 7 children looking back at him. 7 children who had been in 12 placements and knew exactly what it meant when an adult assigned chores. The wrong answer here would land wrong. He could feel that. "Nothing you aren't comfortable with," he said finally. "I don't need you to do anything you're not able to do, but there's work here if you want it. Real work, not made-up work. The kind that matters." Another silence. "Like what?" Carl said. "Feeding chickens, collecting eggs, bringing in firewood. The older ones, if anyone wants. I could use help repairing a section of fence on the south pasture. It's cold work, but it's not complicated." He watched Evelyn's face. She was listening carefully. "The horses," he said, "need to be brushed every day. If anyone wants to take that on, I won't stop them." Nettie's hand went up so fast she nearly knocked her bowl over. Said, he gave them the afternoon with the horses. Not because he'd planned to, but because by noon it was apparent that the horses were more effective than anything he could have said. He brought them all out to the paddock after the morning work was done and stood back. Nettie went straight to the nearest horse, a big gray mare named Sunday, with zero fear and total confidence, the way children who are afraid of the wrong things often approach animals with the right things. Sunday tolerated her. Within 20 minutes, Sunday was following Nettie around the paddock. James, who had been silent since waking up, pressed himself against the fence to watch. One of the younger horses, a bay gelding called Ticket, ambled over and put his nose to the fence rail, and James froze, not in fear, but in a kind of reverent stillness, the way children go still when something beautiful happens to them. He put out his small hand. Ticket breathed on it. James giggled. It was the first sound Gideon had heard from him besides breathing. He looked over. Thomas was watching this from about 10 feet away, and his expression had shifted. Not to something warm, exactly, but to something less locked, like a door that hadn't opened but had at least been touched. May was standing very close to Gideon. She'd been doing that all day. Not clinging, just staying within arm's reach, always knowing where he was. He'd been careful not to make a thing of it, not to acknowledge it in a way that would embarrass her or make her self-conscious. He crouched down to her level. "Which one do you like?" She looked at the horses for a long time. Then she pointed at the smallest, a brown mare named P, who was technically a working horse, but had the disposition of something a lot softer. "Good eye," Gideon said. "P's the nicest one of the bunch." May didn't say anything, but she looked at him with large, considering eyes, and then she nodded once, like they had agreed on something. By the time the stars came out again on that first full day, Gideon had 7 children under his roof who had, between them, cried twice, laughed 4 times, eaten all the food he put in front of them, and fallen asleep in 3 separate rooms with the casualness of people who had, for the moment, decided this place was safe enough to let their guard down. He sat on the porch again, and this time the coffee was hot. He didn't know if he was doing this right. He didn't know what right looked like. He was a man who knew cattle and fences and weather and cold, who could read a landscape and track a calf in a blizzard, who had built a house and a marriage, and then watched one of those things end in a way he still hadn't fully absorbed. He didn't know how to be what these 7 children needed, but he knew how to show up tomorrow. He knew how to put wood on the fire. He knew how to make sure there was food on the table, even bad food. He figured he'd start there. He looked up at the mountains, dark against the sky. The same mountains he'd looked at every night for 6 years, with Nora beside him and then without her. They hadn't changed. They didn't care about any of it. From inside the house, he heard something, a sound so small he almost missed it, someone laughing. Nettie, he thought, from the pitch of it. And then a lower sound, Carl probably, and Robert talking over both of them. He sat with that sound for a moment. Then he went inside. The second week was worse than the first. The first week had the quality of novelty working in its favor. New place, new faces, new horses, the cautious excitement of children who hadn't learned yet whether to be hopeful or not. By the second week, the novelty had worn off and what was underneath it started showing. That's when Gideon found out what he'd actually taken on, and it was considerably more complicated than 7 children who needed food and a roof. It started with Thomas. Gideon had been giving the boy space the way Evelyn had suggested, not pushing for conversation or eye contact or any of the ordinary social signals that adults expected from children. Thomas did his assigned work, feeding the chickens, bringing firewood, without complaint and without comment. He ate, he slept. He was present in the house the way furniture was present, and Gideon had been treating that as a kind of fragile progress. Then one morning he came in from the barn and found Thomas standing in the middle of the kitchen holding a cast-iron skillet, and Gideon's ranch hand, Dale, was backed against the far wall with his hands up, and the air in the room had the particular quality of something that had almost gone very wrong. Dale was the Thursday hand, a decent man in his 40s, reliable, not someone given to cruelty. But he'd come in the back door without announcing himself the way he'd been doing for 3 years, and Thomas had been alone in the kitchen, and apparently the sound of that door had done something to the boy that bypassed everything between hearing and reacting. Gideon stepped in quietly. "Thomas." The boy's knuckles were white on the skillet handle. He didn't look at Gideon. "You can put that down," Gideon said. He kept his voice the same way he kept his voice with spooked horses. Steady, no urgency, no edge. "It's Dale. He works here. He's not going to hurt you." Thomas stood rigid for another moment. Then he set the skillet down on the stovetop with extreme care, like he was worried about making noise. He walked out of the kitchen and into the spare room and closed the door behind him with a click. Dale let out a long breath. "Lord, what happened to that kid?" "I don't know," Gideon said. "I know enough." He sent Dale out to the south fence and went and stood outside the spare room door. He didn't knock. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said through the door, "I'm going to tell Dale to knock from now on, both hands. When they come in, they knock. Okay?" Silence. "You don't have to answer," Gideon said. "I just wanted you to know." He went and told Dale. Dale, to his credit, didn't argue about it. That was Tuesday. By Friday, something else had surfaced, this time with Robert, who had been cheerful and talkative in the way Evelyn had said meant fear, and who Gideon now found sitting on the cold porch steps at 6 in the morning, crying so hard his whole body shook. Gideon sat down next to him. He didn't say anything immediately. The mountains were pink at the tops with the early light, and the yard was still in the blue shadow of the house. "I thought you left," Robert said, finally, between shuddering breaths. "I woke up and you weren't in the house, and I thought, I was in the barn, morning feeding." "You didn't say." "I didn't think about saying. I'll say from now on." Gideon looked at the boy's face, red blotched, genuinely terrified underneath the embarrassment of having been caught. "I should have told you my routine. That's on me." Robert scrubbed his face with his sleeve. "I'm not a baby." "I know. People leave, adults leave. They say they won't, and then they do." "I know." Gideon said again. He didn't add anything to it. He'd learned quickly that what these children needed wasn't promises. They'd had promises, but consistency. Action, not words. You said you'd knock, and you knocked every time. You said you'd be in the barn, and you were in the barn. He couldn't promise he'd never leave. Nora hadn't promised to leave either. What he could do was tell them where he was going before he went. He started leaving a note on the kitchen table every morning before he went out. A simple thing. In the barn. Back by 6:30. G. It felt almost silly, leaving notes for children who might not all be able to read well. But he did it anyway, and within 3 days he noticed Robert checking the table the moment he came down the stairs every morning, and the set of his shoulders when he found the note was measurably different from the set of his shoulders when he didn't. Small things. He kept discovering that it was always small things. Evelyn watched all of this with the attentiveness of someone running a security operation. She tracked how Gideon handled each incident, cataloged it, filed it somewhere in that careful mind of hers. She wasn't warm toward him exactly, but she wasn't hostile. She was measuring. He understood that. He'd have done the same in her position. The friction between them was mostly about authority. Who had it? Who should? Where the boundaries were. She'd been making decisions for these children for a year, and she wasn't going to stop just because an adult had appeared. He didn't try to take that from her, but there were moments where their ideas about what was best didn't line up, and those moments were uncomfortable. The worst one happened in the 3rd week over May. May hadn't spoken since the first night. Not a word. Not in 3 weeks. She communicated in other ways, gestures, nods, the way she positioned herself near things or people. She was present and engaged and clearly understood everything being said to her. She just wasn't saying anything back. Gideon had left her alone with it, the way Evelyn had asked. But he'd also been watching, and what he was watching told him that May's silence wasn't peace. It was the absence of something she was afraid to reach for again. He made a decision on a Thursday afternoon. He was working at the kitchen table on ranch ledgers, and May had settled herself nearby with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil she'd found somewhere, drawing something with focused concentration. Gideon watched her for a while without making it obvious. Then he said, very quietly and without looking up from the ledger, "What are you drawing?" May's pencil stopped. A beat of silence. Then, in a voice so small it was almost not a voice at all, she said, "A horse." He didn't react beyond saying, "P?" Another small silence. "Yes." He went back to his ledger. She went back to her drawing. Nothing more was said. When Evelyn found out, Carl told her because Carl noticed everything, she appeared in front of Gideon that evening with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp. "I told you not to push her," she said. "I didn't push. I asked what she was drawing. That's pushing. She has to choose." She did choose. He met her eyes. She answered. "I didn't press it. I let it be what it was." Evelyn stared at him. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. "You can't just do what you think is right with them," she said. "You don't know them." "You're right," he said. "I don't know them as well as you do. But I know a little bit more than I did 3 weeks ago. And what I know about May is she's not scared of being heard. She's scared of being ignored after she speaks." Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it. "She's been talking to me a little more each day since Thursday," Gideon said. Not gloating, just saying it. "Mostly about P. Sometimes about other things." Evelyn looked at the floor. When she looked up, the sharpness had shifted into something more complicated. She stopped talking after the Garfield placement. An adult said something to her. I don't know exactly what, she hasn't told me. And she just went quiet. That was 8 months ago. "I know," he said. "You told me someone had hurt her." "I told you she sometimes doesn't talk." "I didn't say why." "No, but you look after her the way someone looks after something that's been broken before." I could figure out the rest. A long silence. Outside, they could hear Robert's voice from the yard, some story he was telling Carl with full theatrical investment. "She's going to be okay," Gideon said. Not as a promise, just as a thing he believed. Evelyn pressed her lips together. "You don't know that." "No, but she's talking about a horse, that's something." It wasn't forgiveness, what moved across Evelyn's face. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something that hadn't been there before. A small easing, the way ice sounds when a thaw starts moving under it, a sound more than a change. She went back to whatever she'd been doing, and he let her go. The business of the ranch went on around all of this because it had to. The cattle needed attention regardless of what was happening in the house. The fences needed checking. The horses needed work. His two hands, Dale on Thursdays and a younger man named Pete on Mondays, had to be managed, their tasks assigned, the results inspected. The property covered 400 acres, and it had been running short-handed since June. He started bringing Carl and Evelyn with him on the fence rounds. Not because he needed the help exactly. The fence rounds were mostly just riding and looking, but because the ranch made more sense when you could see it whole, and because working alongside someone was an easier way to be with them than sitting across a table. Evelyn was a fast learner. She had the kind of mind that wanted to understand how things connected. Why the south fence mattered more than the north fence. What the pattern of the cattle's grazing told you about the water situation. Why he'd run the windbreak where he had. She asked good questions and remembered the answers and asked follow-up questions the next time out. Carl didn't ask as many questions, but he absorbed information with the thoroughness of someone storing it carefully. By the 5th week, Carl knew where every tool on the property was kept and could anticipate what Gideon was going to need before he knew himself. Nettie, who had attached herself to the horses with the fervor of a religious conversion, had learned all 6 of their personalities and was negotiating with Gideon about whether she could try riding Sunday, the big gray mare, without the lead rope. "She trusts me," Nettie said. "She tolerates you," Gideon said. "That's different. She follows me around. She follows you because you smell like the apple pieces you keep sneaking her from the kitchen." Nettie's expression flickered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "There are core remnants behind the water trough." A beat. "Maybe some core remnants." He almost smiled. "Another month. You ride her with the lead rope for another month, and we'll talk." Nettie examined him with the thoroughness of someone looking for a loophole, found none, and went back to Sunday with the air of a person accepting unfair terms under protest. James, who was 5 and the youngest, had sorted the ranch into things that were interesting and things that were not. Chickens were very interesting. The barn cat, a gray antisocial creature named something Nora had called him that Gideon could no longer remember, was extremely interesting, though the feeling was not mutual. Fence posts were not interesting. Paperwork was not interesting. He'd taken to following Gideon on the morning rounds in silence, trudging through snow in boots that were slightly too big, watching everything with the gravity of a very small scientist. He rarely spoke. He also rarely seemed unhappy. Gideon had come to understand, a quality of simple endurance, not the lockdown kind Thomas had, the kind that came from bracing against something, but a softer kind. The kind of a child who had learned to find a point of stillness wherever he was. On a cold Monday in December, James stopped in the middle of the yard and announced, "I like it here." Gideon stopped walking. "Yeah? It smells better than the other places." He thought about this. "Like animal smell. And wood smoke." "Is that good?" James looked at him with the patience of a 5-year-old explaining something to a slow adult. "It smells like outside. The other places smelled like inside." He started walking again. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment, then followed. The threat, when it arrived, didn't arrive the way threats usually did. Victor Crow wasn't a man who announced himself. Gideon knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew Crow's name, but he hadn't had direct dealings with him. Crow's operation was mining, primarily, a series of claims up in the higher country that he'd been consolidating for years, buying out or muscling out the smaller operators, building something he intended to be significant. He had money, and he had lawyers, and he had the particular confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight he cared about. Gideon first heard Crow was interested in the Double H from his neighbor Will Eustace, who came by on a Wednesday with his wife's preserves and a piece of information. "He sent a man out to look at your property," Will said, standing in the yard. "Couple weeks back, while you were in town." "What kind of looking?" "The kind with a notebook." Will looked uncomfortable. "Vic Crow's been buying up land around the mining roads for a while now. Yours sits on a corridor he wants. Plenty of land around here he could buy. Plenty that doesn't have a good well in a straight line to the Denison Creek Road." Will scratched the back of his neck. "He's also heard about the children." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What about them?" Crow has contracts with the Placement Society, has for years. When he needs workers at the mines, below the legal age sometimes, he goes through them. Will met his eyes. He knows you've got 7 of them. He knows Pruitt didn't get proper compensation on the placement. There wasn't compensation to get. I signed the society papers. Crow doesn't see it that way. He's been saying around town that you jumped his arrangement, that Pruitt had those children earmarked for one of his operations. Gideon looked at the mountains for a moment. Did Pruitt say that? Pruitt's careful. He doesn't say things directly. Will adjusted his hat. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing. Crow's a man who decides he wants something and then gets it. He's not in a hurry usually. He's patient. I appreciate you telling me, Gideon said. After Will left, he stood in the yard and turned this information over. He'd known, in some vague way, that what he'd done on the platform at Clearwater Station had consequences he hadn't thought through. You didn't walk up to a man like Harlan Pruitt and redirect 7 children without creating an enemy somewhere downstream. He just assumed the enemy would be Pruitt. Crow was a different kind of problem. He didn't tell the children. Not then. What he did was make some inquiries, a letter to a solicitor in Laramie he'd used twice before, another letter to the county land office confirming the status of his deed. He started being more deliberate about the ranch's books, making sure everything was clean and current, that there was no weakness Crow could find to pull on. He also, for the first time, started thinking about what legal standing he actually had with these children. The Placement Society papers were what they were. A placement agreement, not a guardianship. Evelyn was right that they'd been placed and sent back before. The papers Gideon had signed gave him certain responsibilities and certain authorities, but they weren't ironclad. A man with money and lawyers could find edges to press. He needed to do something more permanent. He just didn't know yet how to do it, or whether doing it was even possible. In the meantime, winter deepened and the ranch turned inward. The cold made a kind of shelter of the house. The woodpile against the north wall got a daily workout, and Gideon added building firewood to the morning chore list, which Carl and Robert took on with competitive energy that resulted in a genuinely impressive stack by mid-December. The kitchen smelled permanently of whatever was on the stove, and Nettie, who had claimed the cooking as her territory with the same possessiveness she applied to Sunday the horse, had turned out to be genuinely talented in a practical, no-frills way that meant meals had gotten considerably better since she'd taken over. She wasn't interested in fancy. She was interested in food that was hot and filling and tasted like something, which, given the pantry's contents, required creativity. "We don't have any more dried beans," she announced one morning. "I know. I'll get some in town. And we're low on salt pork. I'll get that too." "Can you get molasses?" "The real kind, not the watered down." "Nettie, I'm just saying if you're going anyway." "I'll get molasses." She nodded briskly, like a foreman satisfied with a contractor's commitment. She turned back to the stove. He watched her for a second. 8 years old, standing on a piece of firewood she'd positioned next to the stove because she wasn't quite tall enough otherwise, completely at home in a way she hadn't been a month ago. He was aware, in a way he hadn't expected to be, that these children were teaching him things. He'd been living alone in a house where nothing had changed since June, everything placed where Nora had placed it, everything running on the habits of a marriage that no longer existed. The children didn't know that history and didn't respect it, not out of carelessness, but because they had no reason to. They moved things. They rearranged the logic of the space to fit themselves. The table got pushed 3 inches toward the window because the light was better for reading. The boots by the door got sorted by size instead of by owner, which was more practical. The piece of firewood migrated to the kitchen without discussion. He'd resisted some of it internally, some of it had felt wrong in the specific way that grieving people know. The wrong of change, of Nora's arrangement being disturbed. But the table with the better light meant May would sit there in the afternoons and draw in the winter sun, and Gideon had started sitting across from her sometimes, doing the ledgers, and those quiet hours had become something he didn't have a word for but didn't want to lose. The grief was still there. He wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. He woke at 3 a.m. sometimes with it, this physical fact of absence, and lay in the dark until his heart settled. He still reached for Nora's name sometimes when something happened that she would have found funny. He missed her every day with the regularity of weather, not equally, not the same every time, but constant, present. But the house was different now. The silence that had been so total it rang was just not there anymore. And he didn't know whether that was healing or replacement or just distraction. He suspected it was all three, mixed up together in ways he couldn't separate. He was thinking about this one evening in late December, sitting at the table after supper while the children were settled in the main room around the fire. Robert was reading aloud from a book Gideon had found in a box of Nora's things, an adventure story, something with ships, and the others were listening with varying degrees of attention. Nettie was mending something. Carl had a piece of wood he'd been trying to shape into an animal for 3 days and kept dissatisfied with. Thomas sat at the edge of the group, not quite in it, but not outside it either. And then Evelyn appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had something in her hand, a piece of paper. Her face was very controlled, which meant something had shaken her. "What's that?" he said. She crossed to the table and put it down. It was a letter, addressed to the Double H Ranch in a handwriting that was neat and expensive. He read it. It was from a company called Crow Mineral Holdings, signed by someone named Fletcher, who identified himself as legal representative. It was polite and entirely cold. It indicated that the Western Placement Society had certain unresolved contractual obligations regarding the 7 wards currently in residence at the Double H, and that Crow Mineral Holdings, as a society partner in good standing, had a legitimate interest in ensuring those obligations were honored. It suggested a meeting at Gideon's earliest convenience. It didn't threaten anything directly. It didn't have to. The threat was in the architecture of it, the language of legitimate interest and unresolved obligations, the language of a man who'd done this before and knew exactly how to phrase it. Gideon folded the letter. "You read this," he said. "It was addressed to the ranch," Evelyn said. "I didn't know—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. I opened it before I saw it was—" "That's all right." He looked at her. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was scared and refusing to be scared. "Sit down." She sat. In the other room, Robert's voice continued, some dramatic passage about a storm at sea. "What does it mean?" Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet. "It means a man named Victor Crow thinks he has a claim on you kids. He doesn't, but he's going to try to make one." "He can do that?" "He's going to try." Gideon looked at the folded letter. "The papers I signed, the Placement Society papers, they're not the strongest thing I could have. I've been thinking about that. I need to get proper guardianship, legal and formal, through the county court. It'll take time and it'll take money, but it's the right thing to do." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why haven't you done it already?" The question was honest, without accusation. She genuinely wanted to know. "Because I wasn't sure you'd want it," he said. "Legal guardianship. That's a different thing than what we have now. That means something official. On paper. It means you're tied to me as much as I'm tied to you." She stared at him. "You thought we wouldn't want that?" "I thought you might not. That you'd see it as another adult making decisions about where you belong." He met her eyes. "I should have talked to you about it before now." "I know that." The fire in the next room popped. Robert turned a page. "Do it," Evelyn said. "Whatever you have to do, do it." A pause. "If you mean it." "I mean it." She looked at him for a long moment with those evaluating eyes that had been measuring him since the first night on the porch. "Crow," she said. "What kind of man is he?" "The kind who's used to getting what he wants," Gideon said. "The kind who sees people as things to be useful." She nodded, slow and deliberate, like she was filing it, like she was already calculating. "We've dealt with that kind before," she said. "I know you have." He picked up the letter. "This time's different." "Why?" He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "Because this time," he said, "someone's going to fight back." The letter from Fletcher sat in Gideon's shirt pocket for 3 days before he answered it. He wasn't stalling, he was thinking, which was a different thing. The kind of deliberate, patient thinking he applied to problems that didn't have obvious solutions, where acting too fast was worse than acting late. He'd learned that from cattle ranching, from weather, from 6 years of building something in a place that didn't particularly want to be built on. You looked at the whole shape of the problem before you picked up a tool. What he saw when he looked at the whole shape of Victor Crow was this. The man wasn't coming for the land first. The land was secondary. What Crow wanted was to establish that Gideon had no legal standing with these children, that the placement papers were flawed, that the arrangement was irregular, that a grieving widower living alone was not a suitable guardian under any reasonable interpretation of the law. Once he'd established that, the children would go back into the society's custody, and from there into whatever arrangement Crow had waiting. The land would come after, when Gideon was sufficiently weakened and alone. It was a clean strategy. Gideon had to admit that. You didn't fight it by writing an angry letter back to Fletcher. He wrote instead to his solicitor in Laramie, a man named Aldous Kemper, who had handled the Double H's deed dispute 3 years back and had shown, in that process, the particular quality Gideon needed right now. He was stubborn in the way of someone who took being outmaneuvered personally. He laid out the situation in full. The placement papers, the 7 children, Crow's letter, the fact that no formal guardianship had been filed. He asked Kemper what it would take to make the arrangement airtight and how fast it could happen. Kemper's reply came back in 8 days, which was fast for Winter Post. The news was not entirely good. A formal guardianship petition required a county court filing, a home inspection by an approved examiner, character references from established members of the community, and this was the part that sat heavy, a hearing before Judge Elias Croft in Dunmore, the county seat. Croft was a reasonable man by Kemper's assessment, but he was also a man who operated carefully in a county where Victor Crow had significant financial interests. Kemper didn't say Croft was bought. He said Croft was cautious, which amounted to the same problem from a different direction. The other thing Kemper's letter said was that Crow had already been to see him, not about the children, about the Double H's water rights, which shared a boundary with a parcel Crow had recently acquired. It was a probe, Kemper said, feeling out what Gideon had and whether it could be pressured. Gideon read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Through the window, he could see Carl and Robert in the yard, taking turns at the axe on the woodpile. May was at her usual spot at the end of the table, drawing. She was doing a series of horses now, each one named and dated in the corner in her small, careful handwriting. She'd been drawing for 20 minutes and had not spoken, but she had, about 10 minutes ago, pushed a drawing across the table toward him without comment. It was Ticket, the bay gelding. She'd gotten his markings right. He looked at it, then at Kemper's letter, then back at the drawing. He wrote back to Kemper that afternoon. "File the petition," he said. "All 7 children. Move as fast as you can." He told Evelyn that evening. She took it with the careful stillness she brought to important news, absorbing it, turning it, looking for the angles. "A hearing," she said, "in front of a judge." "Yes." "And Crow is already... He's been moving on the edges, water rights, legal inquiries. He's not going to come straight at me if he can come at the side." Gideon looked at her. "I need you to know what's happening. All of you should know." "Not James," she said immediately. "Not James, not in detail, but the older ones." She nodded. She'd been sitting across from him at the table, and now she folded her hands in front of her in a gesture that was older than 13, the gesture of someone who'd been in too many rooms where adults decided things about her life. "You should have done this sooner." "I know." "The papers you signed. You knew they weren't enough." "I knew they weren't ideal. I didn't know Crow was specifically..." "You knew someone could take us back," she said. Not angry, just precise. "At any time. That's been true since we got here." "Yes," he said. "That's been true." She looked at the table, a long quiet, the kind she used when she was deciding something. "What do you need from us?" she said finally. "For the inspection, the examiner who will come to the house, I need the place to look like what it is. A working home. I need you to be yourselves." He paused. "Except maybe slightly less of yourself when it comes to Nettie and the apple situation." Something crossed Evelyn's face that was almost a smile. "I'll talk to her." He told Carl and Evelyn together the next morning, and they told the others in their own way. Editing for age, for what each child could carry. Nettie received the information with immediate bristling outrage on Gideon's behalf that had to be gently redirected. Carl became very quiet and very organized, which for Carl meant thinking. Robert started talking more, which meant he was scared, which meant Evelyn sat with him for an extra hour that night. Thomas, who was told in private by Evelyn, said nothing. He never said nothing in the empty way anymore. His silences had texture now, different temperatures. This one was cold and tight, the kind that came when the world confirmed something he'd already believed. May, who was not told but understood more than anyone gave her credit for, appeared at Gideon's side the next morning during the barn rounds and walked beside him the entire time without speaking. When they were done and heading back to the house, she reached up and took his hand. He didn't say anything about it. He just walked back with his hand around hers, and she let go when they reached the porch steps, and that was the whole of it. January came in hard. The temperature dropped to things a thermometer recorded, but a body couldn't quite accept. The kind of cold that made the air feel solid and turned breath to fog before it left your mouth. The ranch hunkered down. The cattle drifted to the windbreak on the east side of the property and stayed there in a collective mass of body heat. The horses were in the barn most hours. Ice formed on the inside edge of the windows every night and had to be scraped every morning. The children adapted to it the way children adapt to most conditions, completely, without much discussion, adjusting their behavior to what the situation required. They wore everything layered. They learned the particular velocity of movement that kept you warm enough in the yard without working up a sweat that would freeze on you. Nettie was the most resistant to the cold and the loudest about it. James was, surprisingly, unbothered. He'd grown up somewhere cold and had the specific Wyoming child's insulation, that quality of just not minding it. Thomas had started coming to the barn in the mornings. It had begun about 2 weeks after the episode with Dale. He just appeared one morning while Gideon was doing the feeding, standing in the barn doorway in his coat, looking at nothing specific. Gideon had handed him a bucket without comment. Thomas had taken it and fed the horses on the near side of the barn while Gideon did the far side, and then he'd handed the bucket back and left. He kept coming, every morning. Gideon kept not making a thing of it. One Tuesday in January, while they were working in parallel, Thomas spoke. "Is Crow going to take us back?" Gideon kept doing what he was doing, measuring out grain, and answered in the same tone he'd have used for any other question. "No." "How do you know?" "Because I'm not going to let that happen." A silence. The horses shifted. Steam rose from the nearest one's back. "People said things like that before," Thomas said. "And then they let it happen." Gideon set the grain bucket down and turned around. Thomas was looking at him with those flat, dark eyes, and underneath the flatness was something that cost him a lot. The act of asking, the act of wanting to believe the answer and not quite being able to. "I know they did," Gideon said. "I can't undo that. All I can tell you is I mean what I say, and I'm doing something about it. Legal guardianship, papers that hold." He paused. "You can be as skeptical as you need to be. That's fair. I'll just keep showing up." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the next bucket and went back to work. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't trust, but it was a question asked and an answer given, man to boy, and neither of them pretending it was more than that. Crow's next move came in the second week of February, and it came from a direction Gideon hadn't anticipated. It came through Thomas. Fletcher, Crow's lawyer, had apparently spent the intervening weeks doing background research on the 7 children, pulling records from the Placement Society and whatever other sources he had access to. What he'd found on Thomas was this. The boy's legal name was Thomas Aldridge Marsh. His father, one Gerald Marsh, was alive and residing in Cheyenne, where he worked at a freight company. The man had surrendered Thomas to the society 4 years ago, citing inability to provide. He'd signed the paperwork and walked away. What Fletcher had also found, and this was the piece designed to do damage, was that Gerald Marsh's surrender of Thomas had been conditional. There was language in the original paperwork indicating that Marsh retained the right to petition for the boy's return within 5 years if his circumstances improved. The language was buried and probably wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, but it didn't need to hold up. It only needed to exist. Crow had apparently located Gerald Marsh and had a conversation with him. Gideon found out from Kemper, who sent a rider with the information on a Wednesday morning. Fletcher had filed a motion in Dunmore claiming that Gideon's placement of Thomas was legally clouded by the Marsh petition right, and that this cast doubt on the validity of the overall arrangement with all 7 children. They were arguing that if one placement was irregular, the whole agreement was compromised. It was a surgical strike. Gideon had to acknowledge that. He rode to Kemper and Laramie the next morning, leaving the ranch in Evelyn's hands with instructions and the knowledge that she was the most competent 13-year-old he'd ever encountered. The ride took most of a day in the cold. He arrived at Kemper's office with ice in his beard and limited patience. Kemper was a small, precise man who wore his glasses on the end of his nose and thought out loud in long sentences. He walked Gideon through the filing over coffee that had been sitting too long. "The Marsh petition right is weak," Kemper said. "The language is ambiguous and the case law doesn't favor it. But it gives Crow something to argue in front of Croft, and Croft will want to be seen as thorough." "Can Marsh actually get the boy back?" "Probably not. But the argument will slow the guardianship hearing, and that's the point. Every week the guardianship isn't formalized is another week the placement agreement stands alone, and the placement agreement is what Crow can challenge." "What about Gerald Marsh himself? What does he actually want?" Kemper looked at him over his glasses. "I suspect he wants whatever Crow is paying him to want." Gideon sat with that for a moment. "Can we find out what that is?" "We can try." Kemper tapped his pen on the desk. "There's something else. Crow has filed a separate complaint with the county board about the condition of your property, claims it's unsuitable for the housing of minors. He's requesting an emergency inspection." "My property is fine." "Your property may be fine. The question is, who does the inspection?" Gideon understood. "Crow's man. Possibly. The board has discretion on appointments. I have a contact on the board I can speak to, but I won't guarantee the result." He rode back to the Double H in the dark, arriving after midnight. The house was quiet, lit by a lamp in the main room that had been left on. Evelyn, he knew, who would not sleep until she heard him come back. He unsaddled his horse, rubbed him down, gave him extra grain. He went to the house. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her that she clearly hadn't been reading. She looked up when he came in. "What happened?" He sat down across from her and told her everything. He'd made that decision on the ride back, that she needed the full picture, not a managed version of it. She was carrying these children the same as he was, and she deserved to know what they were up against. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Thomas doesn't know," she said. "No. He has to be told." "I know." He looked at her. "I thought maybe you and I together, so he doesn't feel like you're delivering a sentence," she said. "Yes." Another pause. "His father was not a good man." "Tell me." She took a breath. "Thomas told me once, when we were at the Garfield place and he still talked more. His father drank. Not mean drunk, just absent drunk. Thomas mostly raised himself from about 7. When Gerald Marsh signed the papers, Thomas said he wasn't surprised. He said he'd been waiting for it." Gideon closed his eyes for a second. "If this man comes here," Evelyn said, her voice going flat in the way it did when she was holding something down. "If he tries to take Thomas—" "He's not going to take Thomas," Gideon said. "But I want to be honest with you. There will be a court hearing. A judge will have to decide. And between now and then, Crow is going to try everything he can to make us look wrong." "What do we do?" "We don't give him anything to use." He looked around the kitchen. Clean, orderly, Nettie's domain in full evidence. "We keep running this ranch the way we've been running it. We keep being what we are. And I ride to Dunmore and I stand in front of that judge and I make the case." "Alone?" "Me and Kemper." She looked at him. "That's not what I meant." He understood. "You can't come to Dunmore, not for the first hearing. Kemper thinks it's better if—" "I know why I can't come," she said. "I meant, is that enough? You and a lawyer? Against Crow's money and his lawyers and a man who can buy an inspection?" It was a fair question. He didn't have a reassuring answer. "I don't know," he said. "It might not be. But it's what we have." She sat with that. Then she nodded once, accepting it without liking it, which was the most honest response she could give. They told Thomas in the morning, before the others were up. Gideon did most of the talking, Evelyn sitting beside Thomas at the table. Thomas listened with his face very still. He asked 2 questions: whether his father could legally take him, and whether Gideon was going to try to stop it. Gideon answered both directly. Thomas nodded. Then he stood up and put on his coat and went to the barn. Evelyn watched the door close behind him. Her jaw was tight. "Let him go," Gideon said quietly. "He needs to be with the horses right now." "I know," she said. "It doesn't make it easier to watch." The examiner sent by the county board arrived on a Thursday in late February. He was not Crow's man, which was a small victory. Kemper's contact on the board had come through on that at least. He was a county employee named Harris, middle-aged, methodical, who arrived at the Double H with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere warmer. He walked the property for 2 hours. He looked at the house, the sleeping arrangements, the kitchen, the condition of the barn, the livestock. He asked Gideon questions about the children's schooling. Gideon had been handling reading and arithmetic at the kitchen table in the evenings, which Harris noted with something between approval and skepticism. He asked about their health, their meals, their daily routines. He also spoke to some of the children. He spoke to Carl, who answered questions with the steady competence of a much older person, and showed Harris the woodpile as if personally responsible for all 40 cords of it. He spoke to Nettie, who gave a detailed and enthusiastic account of the horse situation that went on considerably longer than Harris had planned for. He spoke to Evelyn, briefly and carefully, and Evelyn answered in a way that was precise and complete and gave nothing away that wasn't asked for. He tried to speak to Thomas. Thomas was in the barn. Harris went to the barn, and Gideon went with him, and Thomas was brushing down Sunday the gray mare. Nettie had long since succeeded in making Sunday a communal animal, with his back to the door. "Son," Harris said, "I have a few questions for you." Thomas kept brushing. A long moment. Then, without turning around, he said, "My name is Thomas, not Son." Harris made a note on his clipboard. He asked his questions. Did Thomas feel safe here? Did he have food and clothing? Did anyone mistreat him? Thomas answered each one with a single word. Yes. Yes. No. "Is there anything you'd like me to know?" Harris asked finally. Thomas turned around then. He looked at Harris with those dark, direct eyes. "I want to stay," he said. 4 words, the most he'd said to a stranger since November. "I want to stay here." Harris wrote something on his clipboard and left. Gideon didn't know what was in the report. He wouldn't know until the hearing. What he did know was that Thomas had spoken, had chosen to speak, had walked himself up to the edge of his own silence and crossed it, because he'd decided it mattered enough. He didn't make a thing of it that evening. But when Thomas came in from the barn and sat down at the supper table, Gideon put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. 1 second, no more, and Thomas didn't pull away. The hearing was set for the 14th of March. The 2 weeks between the examiner's visit and the hearing were not quiet. Crow made sure of that. There were 2 more letters from Fletcher, increasingly formal, one of which referenced Gerald Marsh by name and suggested that Mr. Marsh was prepared to appear at the hearing to contest Thomas's placement. There was a visit from a man Gideon didn't recognize who rode up to the ranch gate, looked at the property for several minutes without getting off his horse, and then rode away. Gideon cataloged these things and said nothing about them to the children, and Evelyn cataloged them also and said nothing to the children either, and they moved around each other with the shared quiet of 2 people managing the same problem from different angles. 5 days before the hearing, Will Eustace came by again. He came inside this time, which he rarely did, and he accepted coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard where Carl and Robert were in the middle of some dispute about the woodpile that appeared to involve a good deal of pointing. "There's talk in town," Will said. "There's always talk in town. About the children, about whether you're fit." He said the word with the discomfort of someone conveying something they personally find offensive. Crow's been putting things around. Nothing he can be held to, just suggestions. What kind of suggestions? That a man living alone with 7 children, children who aren't his from the orphan program, isn't a natural situation. That it raises questions. Will looked at his coffee cup. "I know it's what he has," Gideon said. "He can't attack the property or the care, so he attacks the character. Some people are listening. Some people always listen to that." He set his cup down. "What are you actually here to say, Will?" Will Eustace looked at him. "I'm here to say I'll write a letter, character reference, whatever Kemper needs. My wife, too. She's known you 6 years. He paused. "And if you need someone at that courthouse who isn't a lawyer, I'll come." Gideon looked at him. Will was not a man who offered things casually. He was private and practical and didn't take sides in things that weren't his fight. This was him deciding it was his fight. "I appreciate that," Gideon said. "Don't thank me. I just don't like Crow." Will picked up his coat. "And those kids are good kids. That oldest girl, She came by my place last month looking for a job. Did you know that? What? Offered to help my wife with the winter canning in exchange for extra flour. She didn't tell you. He hadn't known. No. She said, Will almost smiled. She said she was building options in case things went wrong. Gideon stood with that for a moment. 13 years old, building options, planning for the failure of the person who was supposed to be keeping her safe. He didn't know whether to be proud of her or devastated for her. He settled on both. The night before he rode to Dunmore, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and went through everything. Kemper's arguments, the inspection report, the character letters from Will and the two other neighbors, the legal counter-filing challenging the Marsh petition right. He went through Crow's angles, looking for the one he'd missed, the attack he hadn't prepared for. He always found something when he did that, some crack in his own position that he had to shore up. This time he found himself. He was a 41-year-old widower who'd signed papers for 7 orphaned children on an impulse he still couldn't fully explain. He had no experience with children. His wife had been dead 7 months. He was running a cattle ranch that was small by any standard and had been operating short-handed for 2 seasons. He was not, by any reasonable accounting, the obvious answer to the question of who these children should belong to. He knew that. Crow's lawyers knew it. Probably Judge Croft knew it. He stared at the ceiling and tried to think of a counter to it and couldn't because it was true. What was also true was this. Thomas had spoken to a stranger so he could stay. May had taken his hand and let go again without a word needed. Robert checked the morning table for his note before he did anything else. Nettie stood on a piece of firewood to cook food that was better than anything he'd made in 7 months of trying. Carl knew where every tool on 400 acres lived. James fell asleep knowing someone would be there when he woke up. Evelyn had built options. He got up before 4. He dressed and went to the kitchen and wrote the morning note. In Dunmore. Back by dark. G. He put it on the table where Robert would see it. He was saddling his horse when the barn door opened behind him. Evelyn. She was fully dressed, coat and all, in the dark before 5 in the morning. You can't come, he said. I know. She crossed her arms. The barn was cold enough that both their breaths showed. I wanted to say something before you left. He waited. When we were at the second placement, I was 11. Thomas wasn't with us yet. The family there decided after 6 weeks that they didn't want all of us. They asked the society to take back the 3 youngest. Her voice was steady, careful. I argued, I begged. I told them I'd do extra work. The kids would be better, whatever they needed. And the man, he just looked at me and said it wasn't personal and walked away. She paused. I've thought about that a lot. What it would have been different if he'd fought for us instead. Gideon kept still. So I just wanted to say, she said, that you fighting, it's not nothing. Even if it doesn't, she stopped, steadied. It's not nothing. He looked at her across the cold barn, this girl who'd been carrying 6 people for a year and still had enough left over to get up in the dark to say something she thought he needed to hear. I'll be back by dark, he said. She nodded and pulled her coat tighter and went back to the house. And he finished saddling his horse and rode out into the February dark, toward Dunmore, toward a judge and a courtroom, and a man who had money and patience and lawyers and nothing to lose. The road was 40 miles. He had all of them to think. By the time the sun came up behind him and the mountains ahead turned from black to gray to the cold white of early morning, he had stopped looking for the argument he was missing and had settled into the only thing he actually had, which was this. He wasn't leaving without those children. Whatever Crow threw at him in that courtroom, that was his answer. He wasn't leaving without them. He rode through the gate of Dunmore at 9:30, with mud on his boots and ice in his beard, and Kemper waiting for him on the courthouse steps, and the hearing that would decide everything was 2 hours away. Kemper met him on the courthouse steps with a leather satchel under one arm and the expression of a man who had news he hadn't decided how to frame yet. Gerald Marsh is here, he said. Gideon stopped. In Dunmore. In that building. Kemper nodded toward the courthouse. Fletcher brought him. He's cleaned up. New coat, shaved. Someone spent money on him. He paused. He's thinner than I expected. Doesn't look well. Does it matter how he looks? It matters how Croft sees him. Kemper adjusted his glasses. A repentant father is a harder argument to counter than a mercenary one. If Marsh performs, is he being paid? Almost certainly. I can't prove it yet. Kemper glanced at the courthouse door. There's something else. Crow is here himself. Gideon hadn't expected that. Crow didn't usually appear personally. That was the point of Fletcher, the point of the whole apparatus of lawyers and intermediaries. You sent men to do things and stayed far enough back that nothing touched you directly. Why? I think he wants to see it finished, Kemper said. Men like Crow. They don't like loose ends. He's been at this 3 months and you haven't folded. That bothers him. They went inside. The courtroom was small and cold, the kind of room that didn't retain heat well and made no apologies for it. Wooden benches, a low railing, a raised bench where Judge Elias Croft sat with the settled patience of a man who'd been doing this for 20 years and found most of it predictable. He was older than Gideon had expected, past 60, with white hair and the careful eyes of someone who'd learned not to show his thinking. Will Eustace was already there, sitting in the gallery. He gave Gideon a short nod. Fletcher was at the opposing table with a younger associate and a stack of documents arranged with precision. Gerald Marsh sat beside them in his new coat, looking at his hands. He was indeed thin, the kind of thin that came from years of poor living, not from a bad month. His face had the particular blankness of a man who'd been told what to do and was concentrating on doing it correctly. Victor Crow sat in the gallery behind Fletcher's table. He was a large man, late 50s, with the build of someone who had once done physical work and had since gone soft around it without losing the underlying frame. He was dressed expensively and simply, the way men dress when they want to communicate that expense is not something they think about. He looked at Gideon once when Gideon came in, a flat, assessing look, and then looked away. Judge Croft called the proceeding to order and ran through the formalities in a dry, efficient voice. He acknowledged both petitions, Gideon's for guardianship, Crow's challenge via the Marsh petition right, and indicated he intended to hear both in sequence before ruling. Fletcher went first. He was smooth, organized, and had clearly done this kind of work before. He outlined the Marsh petition language, which he presented as unambiguous despite the fact that it was anything but. He submitted the relevant society documents. He called Gerald Marsh to speak. Marsh stood up and made his way to the front of the room with the careful movement of a man on unfamiliar ground. He sat down and answered Fletcher's questions in a voice that was rehearsed in the way of someone who had memorized lines rather than thought through what he actually wanted to say. He'd changed his circumstances, he said. He had steady work now. He had a room of his own. He'd made mistakes, and he knew that. But a man could change, and Thomas was his blood, and blood was blood. Kemper leaned close to Gideon. Your turn in a moment. Be patient. Gideon watched Marsh. The man hadn't looked at him once. He'd also, Gideon noticed, looked at the floor or at Fletcher for every answer. Not at the judge, which was a tell. A man who believed what he was saying looked at the person who needed to believe it. Croft noticed. Gideon could see it in the slight angle of the judge's head. When Kemper's turn came, he approached the Marsh petition with the quiet, methodical energy of someone taking apart a machine to show how it didn't work. He walked through the conditional language clause by clause, citing 3 comparable cases from Wyoming territorial records where similar language had been found non-binding. He submitted the inspection report from Harris, which had come back. Gideon hadn't known this until Kemper told him on the steps that morning, with a clear, positive recommendation. Then he called Gideon to speak. Gideon had thought about this moment for 2 weeks. He'd run through what he might say, the facts, the timeline, the evidence of the ranch's condition, and his ability to provide. Kemper had counseled him to be methodical, to stick to what could be documented, to not be emotional. He stood up and faced Judge Croft and threw out most of what he'd planned to say. I'm not going to tell you I'm the obvious answer to these children's situation, he said. I know I'm not. I'm a widower with a cattle ranch and no experience with children, and I took 7 of them on in about 10 minutes on a train platform in November because I saw a grown man hit a 12-year-old girl for protecting her siblings, and I couldn't walk away from that. Croft's expression didn't change. He kept listening. What I can tell you is what I've seen in 4 months. Thomas Marsh, the boy his father wants back, didn't speak to strangers when he came to my ranch. He barely spoke at all. He spoke to the county inspector in February. He told that man his name, that he wanted to stay. That's what 4 months of being treated like a person does for a boy who's been treated like a problem. He kept his voice even. May Driscoll was mute for 8 months when she arrived. She talks to me now every morning about a horse named P. Nettie Crawford feeds 7 people 3 times a day out of a pantry that would challenge a grown woman. Carl Reese knows the geography of a 400-acre ranch better than men twice his age. Evelyn Cross. He stopped for half a second. Evelyn Cross has been the parent of those 6 other children for a year at the age of 13. What she needs is to be allowed to be 13. A silence in the room. I can't give them what they should have had to begin with, Gideon said. I can't undo what's been done to them. What I can do is make sure nothing else is done to them. And I will. He sat down. Kemper wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it to him. It said, "Good. Now let me handle Marsh." The cross-examination of Gerald Marsh took 25 minutes and dismantled his position with the patience of a man pulling threads from a sweater. Kemper found the inconsistencies in his account of his changed circumstances. The job that had started 3 weeks ago, not the 6 months Marsh had implied, the room that was a shared boarding house situation in Cheyenne, the complete absence of any attempt to contact Thomas in the 4 years since surrendering him. He also, near the end, asked a question that Gideon hadn't known was coming. "Mr. Marsh," Kemper said, "did you receive any financial compensation, promise of compensation, or benefit of any kind from Victor Crow or any representative of Crow Mineral Holdings in connection with your appearance here today?" Fletcher was on his feet immediately. Marsh looked at Fletcher. The look lasted about 1 second too long. "I object to the relevance," Fletcher started. "I'll allow it," Croft said quietly. Marsh looked back at Kemper. "No," he said. He said it too quickly, and his eyes went back to the floor, and Judge Croft wrote something on the papers in front of him with the deliberate stroke of a man making a note he intends to keep. The proceeding recessed for an hour. Gideon sat on a bench in the hall with his coat on because the hall was nearly as cold as outside, and Will Eustace sat down next to him. "How do you think it went?" Will said. "I don't know. Croft's hard to read." He wrote something down when Marsh looked away. "I saw." Will was quiet for a moment. "That man, Marsh, did you know he tried to talk to me before the session, in the street outside?" Gideon looked at him. "What did he say?" "Said he just wanted what was best for his boy, that he hoped people understood." Will shook his head. "He said it the way someone says something they've been told to say, like lines from a play." He looked at his hands. "I almost felt sorry for him." "Almost," Gideon said. "He sold that boy 4 years ago and let Crow rent him back for this." Will's voice went flat. "Almost." When court reconvened, Croft did something neither Kemper nor Fletcher had apparently expected. He asked to see specific documentation on Crow Mineral Holdings' relationship with the Western Placement Society. Contracts, compensation records, the arrangement that Fletcher had referenced in his original letter to Gideon. Fletcher objected. Croft overruled him. Croft gave Fletcher until the following morning to produce the records or explain their absence. The session ended without a ruling. Gideon rode home at the dark. He arrived at the Double H at 9:30 to find the house lit up and all 7 children still awake, which told him Evelyn had made no effort to enforce bedtime. She was at the kitchen table with May beside her. Carl and Thomas were on the bench against the wall. Robert and Nettie were in the doorway to the main room. James was asleep across 2 chairs with his coat still on. They all looked at him when he came through the door. "No ruling yet," he said immediately, because the silence was asking the question. "Tomorrow." Croft asked Crow's side to produce some records. "It's not over." A complicated kind of silence, the kind that held both relief and dread in the same container. Nettie said, "Did you eat anything?" "Not since this morning." She was already at the stove. It was a measure of how things had shifted in 4 months that no one found this remarkable. An 8-year-old woman running a kitchen at 9:30 at night. He looked at Thomas. Thomas was looking back at him with an expression that was harder to read than usual. Not blank, not locked, but braced. Like someone who'd already prepared himself for an outcome and was waiting to find out if they'd prepared for the right one. "Your father was there," Gideon said quietly. Thomas nodded. He'd known. Evelyn had told him. "He's not getting you," Gideon said. "Not as a promise, exactly. He still couldn't make promises about what a judge would decide, but as a statement of his own intention, which was the only thing he actually controlled. That's not happening. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite emotion, or it was emotion that had nowhere to go yet, emotion that would have to wait for permission from the rest of him. Okay, he said. One word. But he said it. He ate what Nettie put in front of him, and then he sent all 7 of them to bed with less resistance than he expected, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while he stared at nothing in particular. He was still sitting there when he heard it, from the spare room, a sound he'd never heard from that direction before. Quiet, controlled, the kind of crying that was happening in spite of itself, that had been held back so long it couldn't be held anymore. He knew without question whose it was. He sat very still and didn't move because some things demanded witness and not intervention. Because Evelyn Cross had been holding 6 people together for a year and had not once, in 4 months at the Double H, let any of it out. Because 13-year-olds who turned themselves into adults before they were ready still had the 13-year-old inside them somewhere, and sometimes it found its way to the surface in the dark, when the fight of the day was over. He sat there until it stopped. Then he went and knocked softly on the spare room door. A long pause. "I'm fine," she said, muffled, steady, recovering fast. "I know you are," he said. "I just wanted to say, you did a good job today, holding things together here. You always do." Silence. "Gideon?" Her voice was different from usual. The layer of management was mostly off it. "What if he says no?" He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "Then we find another way. Kemper knows appeals. There are other courts above Croft." "That could take years." "Yes. What happens to us while you stay here?" he said. "That doesn't change regardless of what Croft says tomorrow. The placement papers hold until something overrides them, and nothing overrides them tomorrow. You're here. That's the fact." Another silence. "You can't know that for certain," she said. "No," he agreed. "I can't." He pushed off the doorframe. "Get some sleep." He heard her settle. He went back to the kitchen and let the fire go down and finally went to bed himself. And for the first time in weeks, he slept without waking at 3. Kemper sent a rider at noon the next day. Croft had ruled. The Marsh petition right had been found non-binding. The language too ambiguous. The circumstances of Gerald Marsh's appearance too compromised. Croft had noted in his ruling that the financial relationship between certain parties and Mr. Marsh's recent change of position had raised questions the court could not ignore. He had not named Crow directly. He didn't need to. The guardianship petition for all 7 children was granted. Gideon read the letter twice. Sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon in March, with Nettie stirring something on the stove and James explaining something at length to the barn cat, who had somehow migrated indoors over the winter, he read it twice and then set it down carefully on the table. "What is it?" Nettie said, because she missed nothing. He looked up. She was watching him with a spoon in her hand and flour on her sleeve. "Good news," he said. She stared at him for a second. Then she dropped the spoon and ran to find Evelyn with a volume that probably startled the horses. What followed was not a celebration exactly. These were children who'd learned not to celebrate things that could still be taken away, and the habit didn't break overnight. But there was something in the house that afternoon that had a different quality than the preceding months. A loosening, a slight unclenching of the collective breath that had been held since December. Thomas, when he heard, went outside. He was gone for about 40 minutes. When he came back, his eyes were red in the particular way of someone who has been crying outdoors in cold air where no one could see. He sat down at the table and didn't say anything, and nobody said anything to him about it. And after a while, Carl put a cup of hot coffee in front of him and sat beside him, and that was enough. But Crow was not done. Gideon knew that even as he read the letter, a man like Crow did not lose gracefully. He accepted it, filed it, recalculated. The question was in what direction he'd recalculate. The answer came 3 days later on a Sunday evening when Gideon saw 2 riders coming up the road from the south. He was on the porch. The light was going down, and he'd been watching the mountains go from white to gray to purple the way they did at this hour. And the 2 riders came at a pace that wasn't urgent but wasn't casual either. He stood up. One of them was Fletcher. The other was a man Gideon recognized from town, a deputy named Cass who worked under Sheriff Holden. Cass was young and tended toward being led by whoever was talking to him, which made him malleable in ways that could be used. Gideon came down off the porch and met them in the yard. "Mr. Hale," Fletcher said. He was careful, contained, the way he always was. "We have a matter to address." "What matter?" "Mr. Crow has become aware of a situation that he believes the court ruling doesn't fully resolve." Fletcher reached into his coat and produced a document. "This is an injunction filed this morning with the Circuit Court in Cheyenne, citing concerns about the well-being of the minor children in your care. It supersedes the county ruling pending review." Gideon didn't take the paper. "On what grounds?" "New evidence regarding the fitness of the guardianship arrangement has come to light." Fletcher's voice was smooth and empty of anything. Specifically, documentation suggesting that one of the children, the youngest girl, May Driscoll, has family connections that were not disclosed during the original placement process. Connections that would, under territorial law, create a prior claim over your guardianship petition. Gideon looked at him. "What family connections?" Fletcher almost smiled. "That's what Mr. Crow would like to discuss." "Crow doesn't want to discuss anything. He wants me off this land and those children in his mine." "Mr. Hale, I've read your letters for 3 months. I know what Crow wants." He took the injunction now, took it and looked at it. It was real. It was filed. The circuit court stamp was genuine. "Who is this alleged family?" Fletcher paused, then precisely. "May Driscoll is the granddaughter of a woman named Clara Hale, your late wife's mother." The yard went completely quiet. Gideon stood very still. "Your wife, Nora Hale Nay Driscoll, was the sister of May's father," Fletcher continued, "who died in an accident in 1881. May's mother surrendered her to the society in 1882, citing inability to provide. We believe this connection was either unknown to you or was not disclosed during placement." He waited. "Under territorial law, a blood relative's claim takes precedence over—" "I know what territorial law says," Gideon said. His voice was quiet. It was very controlled. He was aware of things happening inside him that he wasn't going to let show. "Get off my property. Mr. Hale, the injunction is a piece of paper that I will respond to through my solicitor. Get off my property." Deputy Cass looked uncomfortable. He hadn't spoken yet. He looked at Fletcher, who held Gideon's gaze for another second, and then Fletcher folded his hands and nodded. "The circuit court will expect a response within 10 days, he said. He put his horse around and rode back down the road. Cass followed, not looking back. Gideon stood in the yard until they were gone. Then he turned and went inside. May was in the main room with a book in her lap that she wasn't reading. She'd been there since before the riders came. She'd seen them through the window, he knew, because she tracked movement on the road with the instinct of a child who'd learned to read incoming traffic as a survival skill. She was looking at him with those large, careful eyes. He sat down on the floor in front of her chair, which put them at eye level. She blinked at the suddenness of it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. He told her, in the simplest way he knew how, what Fletcher had said. She listened the way she listened to things, completely, without interrupting, with her hands still in her lap. When he finished, she sat for a moment. Then she said, "Nora was your wife?" "Yes." "So she was related to my papa?" "Her brother." "Which makes her your—" "Yes." May thought about this. "Did you know?" "No." That was the truth. He hadn't known. He'd known almost nothing about Nora's brother beyond that he'd died, and that Nora had carried that quietly for years. She'd mentioned May's mother. No, she hadn't. She'd never mentioned May. He hadn't known. "Is that why you took us?" May said. "At the station." "No," he said. "I didn't know. I saw what I saw, and I did what I did, and I didn't know." She looked at him, processing. "Does this mean I have to leave the others?" she said. "No," he said. And this time it was a promise, because it was something he controlled completely. "No, it means someone found out something they thought they could use against us. They thought—" He stopped. "They thought I'd choose you over the others, because you're connected to Nora." May looked at him steadily. "Will you?" He met her eyes. "No." "Because that would be wrong," she said simply. "A statement of fact, not a question." "Yes," he said. "That would be wrong." She looked down at the book in her lap. She smoothed one page with her small hand. "Okay," she said. He stayed on the floor for a moment longer. He wasn't sure he could stand up yet, to be honest. The thing that was happening inside him, the thing he hadn't let Fletcher see, was complicated and enormous, and connected to Nora in ways he'd have to sit with later, alone, in the dark. The strangeness of it, the way the world had wound a thread between him and these children that he hadn't known was there. He stood up. Evelyn was in the doorway. She'd heard everything. Of course she had. She'd been listening with the precision she brought to anything that bore on the children's safety. "You're going to fight it," she said. Not a question. "I'm going to fight it." He looked at her. "All 7. I want to be clear about that. The connection to Nora doesn't change anything. May belongs here the same as everyone else. Equally." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that he'd never quite seen there before. Not the measuring look, not the careful management. Something more like the thing that lives underneath all that, when a person finally stops bracing for the floor to fall out. "I know," she said. It was the first time she'd said anything like that to him. Not, "I think," or "I hope," or maybe, just, "I know." He wrote to Kemper that night. He laid out what Fletcher had said about May's connection to Nora's family, and he told Kemper that he intended to fight the injunction on the grounds that it was filed in bad faith, and that the blood relative provision, properly interpreted, did not override an existing guardianship grant when the guardian was already a member of the relevant family by marriage. He wasn't certain that argument would hold. Kemper would know better, but he wanted it made. He also wrote something else in the letter, at the end. He asked Kemper to look into the Crow Society contract records that Croft had ordered produced. He wanted to know what was in them. He had a feeling, the same kind of feeling he got when a storm was coming and the air pressure changed before the clouds appeared, that there was something in those records Crow hadn't expected to expose. The response came back in 5 days. Kemper was characteristically compact. The contract records, he wrote, had been partially produced. Some documents withheld on technical grounds that Kemper was challenging. But what had been produced showed a pattern. Crow Mineral Holdings had paid the Western Placement Society placement fees for a total of 23 children over 4 years, all placed in Crow's mining operations. Several of those children were below the legal working age at the time of placement. 2 of the placements had resulted in reported injuries that the society had declined to investigate. Kemper had shared these records with the county prosecutor's office. He also attached a note from the prosecutor, a man named Weil, indicating that he was interested in speaking with Gideon and possibly with Kemper in the near future. The injunction, Kemper wrote at the end, was on very shaky ground given the emerging record. He would argue for its dismissal at the circuit hearing, which was scheduled for early April. He expected to succeed. Gideon read this letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in late March, with the sun coming through the window at an angle that was actually warm for the first time since November. He read it twice, the way he'd read the guardianship ruling, and then he set it down. Thomas was in the barn. James was explaining something to the barn cat, who had given up resisting and now lived inside permanently. May was at the end of the table drawing. Nettie's voice was coming from outside, which meant she was with Sunday, and the conversation she was having with the horse sounded one-sided but animated. Carl and Robert were arguing about something in the yard. Evelyn appeared from the back room and poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window. "It's warming up," she said. "Getting there." She turned from the window and looked at the letter on the table. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news," he said. "Mostly." She sat down across from him. He slid the letter across the table and she read it. She was a fast reader. She'd been voracious about books since arriving, burning through everything on his shelves and starting on Nora's boxes when she ran out. She read the whole thing without expression. When she was done, she put it back down. 23 children, she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Some of them are probably still there, in the mines. Kemper will push the prosecutor to look at that. I'll push too." She nodded. She looked at the letter. "The injunction. Kemper thinks it falls apart at the April hearing. And then? And then it's done. The guardianship holds. The injunction is dismissed. Crow runs out of legal ground." He looked at her. "He'll still have money and connections. He won't be removed from the territory. But he won't have a case anymore. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the table. "When I was 12, she said slowly, "at the second placement, after the one where they sent the little ones back, I made myself a kind of promise. That if we ever got somewhere real, I wouldn't let myself believe it until a year had passed. Because a month could be taken away. 3 months could be taken away." She paused. "I told myself a year was enough time to know." He waited. "We've been here 4 months, she said. "I know." She looked up. There was something different in her face. Not softened, exactly, because Evelyn wasn't soft and probably never would be. But present, in a way she'd been protecting herself from being. "I'm going to try to believe it before the year," she said. "I'm going to try." He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't tell her that was the right choice, or that things were going to be fine, or any of the things adults said that meant nothing. He just nodded. "That seems fair," he said, and she sat across from him in the warming morning light and drank her coffee, and May drew horses at the end of the table, and outside the yard was starting to lose its winter gray, and somewhere in the barn Thomas was doing what he did every morning with a silence that was no longer empty. There was still April ahead, still the circuit hearing, still Crow with his money and his patience and his damaged record, but not yet his defeat. Gideon knew that. He wasn't going to pretend the fight was finished, but the injunction was crumbling and the prosecutor was asking questions, and Kemper was confident, and in the kitchen the spring light was doing what spring light did, arriving without asking, changing the temperature of everything it touched. He picked up his coffee cup. Across the table, Evelyn looked out the window at the yard where her children were arguing about firewood, and for a moment she wasn't managing anything at all. She was just watching, and something in the set of her shoulders was a fraction of an inch lower than it had ever been. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. Some things you just let be. The circuit court hearing in April lasted 4 hours and ended without drama, which was its own kind of victory. Kemper had been right about the injunction. It fell apart under examination, the way things built on bad foundations tend to fall apart. Not with a crash, but with a slow, ugly subsidence, each supporting argument giving way until there was nothing left holding it up. The blood relative provision, properly read under territorial law, did not override an existing guardianship granted by a county court, particularly when the petitioning guardian was himself a member of the extended family by marriage. Fletcher argued the point with less conviction than he'd had in March, which told Gideon that even Fletcher knew it was finished. The circuit judge, a woman named Hargrove, which Gideon hadn't expected and Crow's team clearly hadn't either, dismissed the injunction in 40 minutes and made a point of noting in her ruling that the petition appeared to have been filed for purposes unrelated to the genuine welfare of the child in question. She didn't say the word fraudulent. She didn't need to. The prosecutor, Vile, was in the courtroom for the second half of the session. He was taking notes. Gideon rode home that afternoon through the first real warmth of the year, the kind of April day that felt like the land exhaling after a long hold. The snow was off the lower pastures. The creek was running hard with melt. He could smell the ground coming back to life in the particular way of Wyoming spring. Not gentle, not gradual, but sudden and forceful, the way everything happened in that country. He got back to the Double H at 4 in the afternoon. All 7 children were in the yard. He didn't know how they'd known the timing. Probably Evelyn had calculated the ride. But they were there, doing various things with the studied casualness of people who have been watching the road for an hour and are pretending they haven't. Robert was stacking wood that didn't need stacking. Carl was checking the fence gate latch for the 3rd time that day. Nettie was with Sunday in the paddock, but she had positioned the horse so that she faced the road. James was just standing in the middle of the yard, making no pretense at all. He was 5 and had not yet learned that hoping for things was something you were supposed to disguise. Gideon swung down from his horse and said, "It's done." For a moment, nobody moved. Then James made a sound that was somewhere between a word and not a word, and ran at Gideon with the full-body commitment of a 5-year-old who has decided that momentum is enough of a plan, and Gideon caught him, and the boy wrapped both arms around his neck and held on. Over James's shoulder, he looked at the others. Evelyn was standing slightly apart from the group, the way she always stood. She was watching him with those measuring eyes, and then slowly, like something mechanical releasing, the measurement stopped. She just looked at him. He gave her a nod. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw what was there. He let her have the privacy of it. Crow's legal defeat was complete but not instant in its consequences. Men with money rarely faced consequences at the speed that justice technically required. What happened over the following weeks was slower and less satisfying than a clean ending. Vile's investigation into the Placement Society contracts moved at the pace of bureaucratic machinery, which was to say it moved and you couldn't always see it moving. But it moved. By May, the Western Placement Society's Wyoming operation had been suspended pending investigation. Harlan Pruitt, the man who had stood on the Clearwater platform and hit Evelyn and seen it as a reasonable response to inconvenience, was being asked questions by the prosecutor's office that he was finding increasingly difficult to answer. 2 of the other children placed through Crow's arrangements had been located and removed from the mining operation. There would be more. Weil had told Kemper there would be more. Victor Crow himself had retained new lawyers and was being very quiet, which was the thing powerful men did when the ground shifted under them. He hadn't left the territory. He probably wouldn't, not right away. He still had his mining operation and his money and his patience. He'd recalculate and find another angle eventually, because men like Crow always did. But he was done with the Double H. Whatever calculus he'd been running about the children and the land and Gideon Hale's alleged weakness, he'd run it again after Hargrove's dismissal and come to a different conclusion. The cost of continuing was too high. He moved his attention elsewhere. Gideon found out about this not through Kemper but through Will Eustace, who came by in May with his wife's rhubarb preserves and the information that Crow's man Fletcher had been seen surveying land 20 miles east toward the Denison Valley. New target, new plan. Somebody else's problem now, Will said. Somebody else's problem, Gideon agreed. Will stayed for supper, which was Nettie's territory, in which she defended against any suggestion of assistance with the focused intensity she brought to most things. His wife had sent a pie, which Nettie accepted with the graciousness of one professional acknowledging another. The table was crowded in the way it was always crowded now. Carl and Robert arguing over something that had started 2 days ago and hadn't resolved. James having a separate conversation with the barn cat who had assumed his customary position at the corner of the table, May drawing in the margin of a piece of paper while she ate. Thomas sitting at his end of the bench with the particular quality of quiet that had, over 7 months, changed from something sealed into something simply still. Will sat across from Evelyn and tried, as he usually did, to make conversation with her. She was warmer with him than she was with most adults. Not warm, exactly, but not armored. He'd earned something in her accounting by showing up at the courthouse, by writing his letter. Evelyn Cross had a very precise internal ledger for what people owed and what they'd paid, and Will Eustace was in credit. "You plan to stay on here?" Will asked her. "When you're older?" Evelyn looked at him. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "I want to study law," she said. Eventually, Will blinked. "Is that so?" "Someone should have known the laws better," she said, "when things were happening to us. Someone who was on our side." She said it simply, without drama. "If I know the laws, I can be that person for other kids." Will looked at Gideon. Gideon kept his face neutral. He'd heard this plan before. Evelyn had told him about it on a cold night in February, sitting at the kitchen table with Kemper's letters spread between them, and it had rearranged something in his chest. He told her women could study law, that it was hard, and the doors weren't open the way they should be, but they weren't fully closed either. She'd said she knew that. She'd said hard was something she had some experience with. "Good plan," Will said finally, and he meant it. After supper, after Will went home and the children drifted toward their evening routines, Gideon sat on the porch in the May dark. The air had that particular sweetness of spring nights in Wyoming, cold still, but with something underneath the cold that promised otherwise. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that still held a line of light in the west. He thought about Nora. He did that more deliberately now than he had in the early months, when the grief had been ambient and unavoidable, soaked into the house and the air and everything he touched. He'd learned, not that the grief passed, because it didn't exactly pass, but that it became something you could set down and pick up, rather than something that simply lived on top of you. He thought about her now with purpose, the way you think about someone you want to keep clear in your mind. He thought about the fact that she had a brother he hadn't known, That somewhere in the tangled, poorly documented record of the Placement Society was a thread that connected the woman he'd married to the small 6-year-old who drew horses at his kitchen table. He'd never know if Nora had known about May, about what had happened to her brother's child, about where she'd ended up. He suspected not. Nora would have done something about it. But sometimes he thought about the platform at Clearwater Station, the way he'd been walking away and then hadn't. The way that impulse, which he still couldn't fully explain, which had seemed in the moment less like a decision than a direction, like a compass needle swinging, had landed him in front of those children instead of back on his horse riding home to the empty house. He wasn't a man who believed in the machinery of fate. He'd seen too much random grief for that, too many people who'd done everything right and still had things go wrong. Nora had gotten sick in June and died, and there was no meaning in it that he could locate, no lesson, no justice. The universe didn't arrange itself around human deserving. But he thought about it anyway, about the ways things connected underground, out of sight, in the dark, before they surfaced. The barn door opened and Thomas came out, crossed the yard, and sat on the step below Gideon without saying anything. He had a piece of wood in his hands that he'd been working into a shape for several weeks. An animal of some kind, or it was becoming one. They sat in the dark for a while. "Carl said you went to law school for 1 year," Thomas said eventually. Gideon frowned. "I didn't go to law school. I read law for about a year before I came west." "Where did Carl get that?" "Carl gets things from everywhere." A pause. "He said that's why you knew how to fight Crow." "Kemper knew how to fight Crow. I just had sense enough to listen to Kemper." Thomas turned the piece of wood in his hands. "When I'm older," he said, "I want to work horses. Not just work on a ranch. I mean, know them, the way you know cattle. Breed them, train them, that kind of thing." Gideon looked at him. 8 months ago, this boy had been silent in a barn stall like a creature waiting for something bad to arrive. "You'd be good at it. Do you think you could teach me more of what you know about training?" "I can teach you what I know. It's not expert level. It's more than I have." They sat for another while. The line of light in the west went out and the stars came in. "My father," Thomas said. He stopped. Gideon waited. "I keep thinking I should feel something about him being in Dunmore, in that courtroom." He turned the wood over. "But I don't feel much. I don't feel angry or sad. I just feel like he was a person I knew once, and now I don't know him. And that's the whole of it." "That might be enough," Gideon said. "Is that wrong, that I don't feel more?" "I don't know what's wrong or right about what you feel," Gideon said. "I know you don't owe him feeling. That's all." Thomas nodded slowly. He went back to his wood. After a while he went inside and Gideon stayed on the porch alone and looked at the stars and thought that if he'd had a son, if things had gone differently and he and Nora had had the time they'd planned for, he might have hoped for a boy something like Thomas. Not easier, just particular, specific, real in the way of people who've been worn down to their actual substance and found it was good enough. June came. It came in stages, the way Wyoming spring always tipped towards summer. Tentatively at first, then with conviction. The lower pastures went green, the cattle spread out across the property and did what cattle did. The horses went back to the paddock full time, and Nettie's campaign to ride Sunday without the lead rope reached its conclusion. Gideon watched her one morning from the fence rail as she took the big gray mare around the paddock in easy circles. No rope, just her weight and her hands and the rapport she'd built through 7 months of apple pieces and patient attention. He didn't say anything when she finished. She rode to the rail and looked at him. "Well," she said. "You've got good hands," he said. She looked like she was going to say something sharp about the understatement of it, and then thought better of it, and instead just sat up straight on Sunday, with the satisfaction of a person who has achieved something they'd decided was worth achieving. He'd been thinking for weeks about the formal piece of it, the adoption, which was a different thing from the guardianship. The guardianship gave him legal responsibility. The adoption would change the children's names, if they wanted, would make the tie permanent in the way that nothing could easily unpick. He'd asked Kemper about the process. It was possible, Kemper said. It would take another court appearance, more paperwork, more time. But it was possible. He'd been uncertain about how to raise it with the children. It felt like the kind of thing that could go wrong if handled clumsily, that could feel like pressure, like an adult deciding something for them again, putting his name on them without asking. Evelyn raised it first. She appeared in the kitchen one morning in early June while he was at the table with the ranch ledgers, and she sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table in the manner of someone who has decided to say a thing and is making sure they say it right. "Kemper sent a letter," she said. He looked up. "I know. I was going to talk to you. About the adoption." "Yes." She looked at the table. A small silence. "I talked to the others," she said. "All of them except James, but I know what James would say." "What would James say?" "He'd say yes before you finished asking." She allowed herself the smallest smile. "Carl and Robert said yes. Nettie—" A pause. "Nettie had conditions." "Of course she did. What conditions?" "That Sunday stays registered in her name specifically, not ranch property, her horse." He blinked. "That's her condition. That's her condition." He sat back. "I can do that." "I told her you'd say that." Evelyn looked at her hands. "May said yes. She said it was what Nora would have wanted, which—" She stopped. They both let that sit for a moment, the strangeness of May knowing something about Nora's wishes that perhaps Nora herself hadn't known she'd have. "Thomas said yes," Evelyn continued. "He said he wants to be Thomas Hale. He wants the name." The name. Gideon hadn't thought specifically about the name. The weight of it landed differently than he'd anticipated. Not heavy in a bad way, but weighty in the way of things that matter. Thomas Hale, Carl Hale, May Hale, all 7 of them with his name, with Nora's name, with the name of the ranch and the land and the 6 years of building something in a place that didn't give anything away for free. "And you?" he said. "What do you want?" Evelyn had been looking at the table. Now she looked at him. "I was Evelyn Cross before all of this," she said. "Cross was my mother's name. She wasn't a bad person. She just got sick, same as Nora." She paused. "I want to keep Cross, my middle name, Evelyn Cross Hale." He nodded. "That seems right." She let out a breath that had been slightly held. Then she straightened her shoulders in the way she had, the automatic correction back to uprightness. "So that's everyone," she said. "I'll write Kemper today," he said. She stood up to go. She was halfway to the door when she stopped. "Gideon." "Yeah." She turned around. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely without armor. No measurement, no management, just the 13-year-old face of a girl who had been too old for too long and was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be her actual age. "Thank you," she said, "for not making us wait another year." He didn't answer right away. He thought about what to say and then said the thing that was true. "You waited long enough." She nodded. She went back to her morning. The adoption was finalized on the 17th of July, in a courtroom in Dunmore that had last held a hearing about them in circumstances considerably less cheerful. Judge Hargrove had agreed to see the petition, which Kemper had considered a good sign. She was not a warm woman. She was precise and thorough, and had the energy of someone who did not like having her time wasted. But she read the petition with care and asked each child a question directly, which Gideon hadn't expected. She asked them whether they understood what they were agreeing to and whether anyone had pressured them in any direction. Carl said he understood completely, and that the only pressure applied had been Nettie's pressure about the horse, which he felt the court should be aware of. Nettie told him to shut up. Judge Hargrove made a note and looked like she was suppressing something. She asked Thomas if he had anything to add. Thomas said no. Then he said, quietly, looking at the judge directly, "I just want it on paper. That's all. I want it on paper so it can't be undone." Hargrove looked at him for a moment over her reading glasses. "That's what this is for," she said, and she signed it. Kemper bought everyone lunch at the only restaurant in Dunmore that could seat 10 people, which was a boarding house that also served food on weekdays. Gideon sat at the end of the long table and ate something he couldn't later remember. Some kind of stew. While 7 children filled the room with noise that the other diners seemed to find either charming or alarming depending on their constitution. Robert was explaining to Carl why the court proceeding had been, in his assessment, more dramatic than Carl was giving it credit for. James had fallen asleep against Gideon's arm, which had become the boy's default position in any situation involving sitting and warmth. May was drawing on a paper napkin, a series of connected horses he could see, marching across the white paper in her small, deliberate lines. Nettie was conducting a post-event analysis of the proceedings with Kemper, who had the expression of a man who'd survived many unexpected conversations but found this one among the more unusual. Thomas was looking at the window, not blankly, not with the sealed expression of the barn in November. He was looking at the street outside the window, at the ordinary afternoon traffic of a Wyoming town going about its business. A wagon, two men talking, a dog trotting with purpose towards something. He was just looking. Present. Somewhere entirely. Evelyn sat beside Gideon. She was eating her stew and not saying much, which for Evelyn meant she was satisfied. Content wasn't a word that sat naturally on her yet. She was still a person who scanned rooms and tracked exits and kept a running account of variables. That probably wouldn't change completely. Some things that get built into a person in the hard years don't get built out. But the scanning had a different quality now. It wasn't looking for threats. It was looking at things. There was a difference. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him with the remnant of her old suspicion, the automatic assumption that adults who watched you were watching for something to use. Then it dissolved. "You're doing that thing where you watch people and don't say what you're thinking. It's a habit. It's annoying." Noted. She went back to her stew. After a moment, she said without looking up, "My mother used to say that family was the people who showed up after the reason to leave was already obvious." He thought about that. Smart woman. She had her moments. A pause. She would have liked this. She would have liked all of them. She glanced at the table, at the chaos of it, the overlapping conversations, James's sleeping wait, Carl and Robert's ongoing argument now joined by Nettie, Kemper's patient face, May's drawing. She was the kind of person who collected people, Evelyn said, couldn't leave anyone behind. "Where do you think you got it?" Gideon said. She looked at him. That landed somewhere. He could see it. Then she looked back at her plate. "Don't be sentimental about it," she said. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. The ride home from Dunmore stretched long and warm, the kind of July afternoon that made Wyoming look like something out of a painting. The sky enormous and blue, the mountains clear to every ridge, the road dusty and gold in the afternoon light. They went in the big wagon, all 9 of them, which was a crowded situation that nobody complained about. James was asleep before they'd cleared the edge of town. May leaned against the side of the wagon and watched the landscape go by with her particular quality of absorption, like she was memorizing it. Thomas rode Ticket alongside the wagon for the first half of the trip and then brought him in and tied him to the back and climbed up beside Carl. Nettie talked about Sunday for 40 minutes with the confidence of someone who had secured her position on paper and was therefore unassailable. Robert told a story. He'd been working on it for days. He'd told Gideon about it, that he was making up a story about a boy who built a ship in Wyoming and sailed it through the mountains. It made no geographical sense, and he was aware of this and didn't care. He told it now to whoever was listening, in the theatrical voice he used for stories, full of invented detail and impossible geography, and a hero who kept making bad decisions for comprehensible reasons. Carl listened with his eyes closed and his face turned up to the sun. Nettie listened while braiding something complicated into a piece of rope she'd found. May listened and drew in the air with one finger, making small, invisible marks that probably corresponded to something in her head. Thomas listened with his eyes open, looking at the mountains. And once, Gideon saw the corner of his mouth move. Gideon drove the wagon and listened to Robert's story and watched the road and felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time and wasn't entirely sure he deserved, which was the specific and uncomplicated piece of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. He thought about what he'd been 7 months ago. The man on the platform who'd been walking to his horse, going home to the empty house, carrying something so heavy he'd stopped noticing its weight. He thought about 10 seconds. The 10 seconds between seeing Pruitt's hand connect with Evelyn's face and finding himself already moving. He thought about how close he'd come to not moving at all, how easy it would have been to look away, the way everyone else on that platform had looked away, and keep walking. He thought about what that would mean, not just for the children, though that was enough, that was more than enough, but for him, what he would have remained if he'd kept walking, what kind of man, what kind of life. People talked about sacrifice as if it went one direction, as if you gave something up and got nothing back, and that was the measure of your goodness. Gideon had lost Nora. He'd lost the future they'd planned. He hadn't stopped losing her. He never would, completely. But what had happened since November wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost. It was something different, something that existed on its own terms, built from different material, pointing in a direction he hadn't known was there. These 7 children had given him back the ability to matter. That was the plain truth of it. Not to be happy or comfortable or settled. Those things were real, and he was grateful for them. But to matter, specifically, in a way that was concrete and daily and unmistakable. You got up in the morning, and there were 7 people whose morning depended on you getting up. You showed up because not showing up had a face and a name, 7 of them, and that was a different thing than showing up for cattle and fences in an empty house. He hadn't saved them. That was something else he'd been thinking about, the way people in town talked. He'd heard it, the narrative of the rancher who'd rescued the orphans, which was a tidy story that fit the shape people expected. But Evelyn had been keeping those children alive for a year before he appeared. Thomas had survived things Gideon couldn't have survived. May had kept some version of herself intact through 8 months of silence and 4 years of institutions and the loss of everything. Carl had built competence out of nothing, because competence was survival. Nettie had turned 8 years old into a working life because it was necessary, and she was who she was. They hadn't needed rescuing. They'd needed someone to stop the machine that kept taking them apart. He'd stopped the machine. That was all he'd done. And they'd done the rest. The Double H came into view around 5. The low profile of the house and the barn against the mountains. The paddock where Sunday was waiting with the patient tolerance of a horse who has been well managed. The chickens were visible in the yard, going about their chickenly business in the evening light. Smoke was going to come from the chimney in an hour when Nettie started supper. Gideon pulled the wagon up to the gate and stopped. Nobody moved for a moment. They all just looked at it. At the ranch, at the house that was too small for 9 people and had been expanded twice in 7 months with help from Will Eustace and Pete and Dale, and one very long weekend that had involved more arguing about lumber than Gideon had thought possible. At the garden Nettie had started in April in the spot where Nora's kitchen garden had been, which was producing things with an aggression that surprised everyone except Nettie. At the fence Carl had helped mend, and the barn that Thomas had cleaned top to bottom in February, for reasons he hadn't explained and didn't need to. James woke up, looked around, registered where he was, and said, "We're home." He said it the way he said most things, simply, without emphasis, as a piece of information he was contributing to the general understanding. He yawned and climbed down from the wagon with the boneless ease of a small child who trusts that the ground will be where it should be. He was already through the gate and heading toward the chickens before anyone else had moved. Robert jumped down after him. Then Carl, then Nettie. Thomas untied Ticket from the back of the wagon and led him toward the barn. May gathered her napkin drawings carefully and folded them into her pocket and climbed down with Evelyn's help, though she was 6 and didn't strictly need it. Evelyn was last. She stood up in the wagon bed and looked at the ranch for a moment before climbing down. The particular look of someone taking inventory, but different from how she'd done it in November. Then she climbed down and straightened her coat and walked through the gate. She stopped in the yard and turned around and looked at Gideon. "You coming?" she said. He was still sitting on the wagon bench. He looked at the house, at the gate, at the 7 children already spreading across the yard, and the barn and the paddock, with the automatic ease of people who know where everything is and where they belong in relation to it. He set the brake on the wagon. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming." He climbed down. He walked through the gate and latched it behind him. The sun was going down behind the mountains, the light going long and gold across the yard the way it always did at this hour in July. It caught the dust from James's footprints where he'd run to the chickens. It caught the curve of Sunday's back in the paddock. It lit the garden where Nora's patch had been, green and unruly and determinedly alive. Inside the house, someone, Nettie already, had started a fire. Smoke rose from the chimney into the clear Wyoming sky, the way it would every evening for years to come, marking this place as a place where people lived. Not perfectly. Not without difficulty. Not without the particular friction of 9 people trying to make something together out of disparate pieces and old wounds, and the daily unglamorous work of choosing each other again and again when choosing was hard. but lived in, fully, with the lights on. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment longer, in the gold light of the evening, and let himself feel the whole of it, the grief still there, the way it was always there, and beside it this other thing, this improbable and unplanned and entirely real life that had walked up to him on a train platform and refused to be walked away from. Some families are made from blood and luck. Some are made from the worst years of everyone involved, from the wreckage of things that should have been better, from the specific and stubborn choice to stop leaving. Those families are built in harder country. They don't look as clean. They carry their history in places that show sometimes. But they hold. He went inside.